Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first of two events today with Professor Barry Lamb, a philosopher at UC Riverside. Dr. Lamb is also the creator and host of the hit Slate podcast Hi-Phi Nation, and this first event will be about humanities podcasting. The second event, beginning at 1 p.m. a little bit later today, we'll be delegating decisions to machines, the case for human discretion, and based on ideas from Dr. Lamb's new book, which we found out is in paperback.
Yeah.
This is a paperback.
I bought 10 copies, $10. Paperbacks are cheaper.
And I just want to say personally how much I love Hi-Phi. So excited for this. So thanks for joining us today. I am not Dr. Madba, who's one of the co-directors of the DHC consortium and also the director of the California Center for Ethics and Policy, but I dress a lot like him, so he asked me to read his introduction. He says my name is Ichabod Crane. That's not actually right. My name is Corey Aragon. I'm a professor in the philosophy department and a DHC faculty fellow and CCEP faculty fellow, I believe. But anyways, what's that? Affiliates, fellows, and the like. Today's events are brought to you by the Digital Humanities Consortium, or DHC, and California Center for Ethics and Policy, or CCEP. Okay. And of course, the wonderful philosophy department at Cal Poly Pomona. Okay. Each year, CCEP organizes programming, including a student fellowship program, a spring seminar class, a student-run podcast, and our annual speaker and panel series around a central theme of national and global interest, but especially pertinent to California. This year's theme is the futures of work. Stay tuned to hear more about the series of spring events we plan around this. Last year, CPP also launched the Digital Humanities Consortium, or DHC. The DHC treats technology as both a tool for and subject of humanistic inquiry. It offers resources for students, faculty, staff, and the broader CPP and Pomona communities, hosting experts, pedagogical workshops, micro-credentialing, and showcasing faculty and student-produced digital scholarship. I also say hi to Rachel Van, the co-director of the DHC. Finally, before introducing you to today's speaker, would like to encourage you to sign up for our mailing list and check out our socials. They will be somewhere, maybe on a PowerPoint, but also been posted in the chat on Zoom. And stick around until the end for information about our post-event survey and a chance to win free swag, including tote bags, nice tote bags, notebooks, and coffee tumblers. Today's event will be recorded, posted on YouTube, and shared on CCEP's podcast channel, which you can find on any podcatcher. In fact, the first two episodes of CCEP's latest season on ethics and policy questions around AI have just been published too. To stay up to date with future philosophy, CCEP, and DHC at CPP events, please join our mailing list and follow us on the socials. I've been told to say smash the likes, chat. Dr. Barry Lamb.
Good, thank you. All right, so I have us at 15 minutes behind schedule at this point. So I'll expedite and exclude some of the things. Usually when I talk about podcasting, there's one of two presentations I give. One is for people who want to do it, right? And then I give them a lot of really practical advice, and I talk about my background and how I went through it and so forth. And then the other thing is I actually just talk about process, how I make a Hi-Phi Nation episode. So we'll see how much I get through. I'm just going to do the second thing today and see how far we get. Let's just start with something that came out of the last season, which was a good almost 3 years ago now. The next season is coming up in the spring. It's just I've had to write basically 2 books since then, and then that's taken up my time. But there's this genre that I felt like I wanted to create when I started the show in 2016, which is a long time ago, which was this genre that I'm going to call philosophical journalism, right? The idea that there's something going on somewhere in the world, in the law, in a courtroom somewhere, a scientific lab somewhere. In this case, a CEO, founder of a company. And I was going to look for things like that in the world that have philosophical significance, like something interesting that's happening. And so I'm just going to give you, I could have given you one of the 60 episodes I've created, but why not just the last one, right? So this is Justin. Justin is a former director. He lives not that far from here. He lives in LA. And Justin, something happened to Justin that made him decide to found a company. Justin was in a motorcycle accident.
I was riding home from work on my motorcycle, and a lady ran a stop sign and almost killed me.
Before the accident, Justin was a successful film producer and director in Los Angeles. He had 9 broken ribs, one of which snapped in half and lodged in his lung, collapsing it. His hip was broken and dislocated. His ankle shattered.
My leg was actually turned the wrong direction. While I was flying, I went to brace myself with my left arm. One of my arms was like a macaroni elbow, and the other leg was the wrong direction, and I was suffocating in my own blood. While I was in the process of recovering, my mom was down here taking care of me.
Justin's mom, Melody, was not feeling well herself on that trip. But the last thing she wanted to do at a time like that was step away from Justin. Anyway, she thought she knew what her health issue was, and it wasn't a big deal.
She had known that she needed to get her gallbladder out for, 10 years at that point. They'd been like, hey, you got to take this out, you got to get rid of it. So after about, 6 weeks, 8 weeks of being down here with me, it was like, all right, we got to get her home and get this gallbladder out. And when they went to go take the gallbladder out, they found cancer, stage 4 cancer.
So you're recovering. You're not well, at this point.
No.
So she has a diagnosis. What's the prognosis at that time?
She had 3 to 9 months at that point.
So then Justin decides to put a bunch of cameras in the recovery room and her room and record interviews with his mom, like tell me your life story. He's collecting data because he has this idea that he's going to turn his mom into an AI avatar that he can interact with after she dies, and then turn that into a scalable business whereby people who have terminally ill parents, children, loved ones, he'll do like the all service, right? Get your avatar and so on and so forth. It didn't really work all that well because it turns out that if you just gather all this content from your mom at the tail end of her life, it's like a certain version of your mom, right? So then he tried to do all this stuff, okay, turns out, you could tell he's kind of a bit of a mama's boy. He saved all the voicemails and emails and texts from his mother, and so he fed that in, right? And then it turns out that was not particularly good either because, so the AI doesn't have an order. It kind of takes everything and then this is the mother. Does that make sense? So then you start interacting with it and then it's the sum total of does that make sense? Everything the mom was before and then all this content later on, right? And then that's another barrier. And then so the final thing that he did was he had to put weights on this was farther away and then this is more weight on the recent but not total weight. Does that make sense? And then only the past 6 months stuff was the stuff that was the highest amount of weight. Oh, boom, right? So he creates this thing. By the way, his mom's dying, right? Towards that. And so there's this scene in the episode, she's on her deathbed, but he activates this thing, right? And has her interact with it. And to see is this you, right? And she starts crying and she says, yes, you actually created, this avatar of me.
Ultimately, I don't believe that a digital representation of somebody isn't them at a certain point, we will cross a threshold where it is so authentic and genuine that the relationship you're continuing to carry as the living person still is indistinguishable between the relationship between two living people. Technology is meant to progress us. It's gonna bring change. That's the whole point of it. If we wanted everything to be the same, we'd just all be cave people sitting around a fire with our same sort of, couple 100 square mile range of hunting ground, and that's what we would do. Well, we opted for something different. Now's definitely not the time to pull the emergency brake. It's gonna happen. It's gonna happen faster than you think you're prepared for. Every generation gets confronted with, this looks a lot different than what I thought life was gonna be about, but that's the whole point.
So that's me asking Justin, the kind of thing that you would ask a person like that, right? Namely, like, do you think this is like really cool? I mean, like, it's a little bit creepy. Do you think people will actually use this, and so forth? And those are his answers. When I got word that there was this guy in Beverly Hills, and I live in West Covina, which is not that far from here. I just drove, it was 15 minutes. I drove out, I interviewed him for a day. This was one of those rare cases where I found the story first, right? So I was like, oh, I definitely found the story here. I gotta use this, right? And then so the last season was 2023. This is 22, November of 22. And that's the very first step to creating a piece of philosophical journalism. Whereas in the academic sphere, when you create a piece of philosophy, you have to think about what you're going to argue. What's the thesis? What's the arguments for the thesis? What are the objections to that thesis and to the arguments for your thesis? That's the meat and potatoes of how we teach philosophy, how the professionals who teach you kind of write it. Every talk is like that. And you may do a little bit of storytelling by presenting a kind of abstract case, like a trolley problem. People, this runaway trolley is about to kill 5 people. Like you might say that. But in the kind of production that I wanted to create, the story was essential, all right? So then you have to think, like, what is a story? Like, what is it in journalism? What is it in fiction? What is it in nonfiction? What is it in, right? And, this is not a big secret. It's something that, you kind of get taught in literature, right? So stories have plots, right? There was a plot, the very first piece of audio, a sequence of events of things that are happening to individuals. Stories have scenes. There's a setting. In the setting, there are things, it looks a certain way. Right? It smells a certain way. There are characters that are protagonists, and characters that have traits and that want something. You know what I mean by that, right? So you have descriptions of traits, but you also have to describe the psychological profile, right? In order for a character to be a character in a story, they have to drive that story. And usually what drives the story are wants. What a character wants is very important. That's the motivating factor of the story. Justin wants a version of his mother that survives the death of her body, right? Every Disney movie begins with a princess singing a song about what she wants, right? That's basically the character sketch and the character motivation. And then you have things like exposition and twists and turns. What happened next? Right? And I kind of did that here. I kind of said, he tried it this way, but it didn't work. Right? You need to have that in a good story with any particular angle. Stories have tones, right? Philosophy generally doesn't have a tone. I actually think it does. They all have the same tone. But we don't think about it that way. We don't think of philosophy arguments like ideas as having a tone, even though they do, right? But stories generate a tone, right? We kind of know that this isn't a zany episode, right? And it's not just the way that I soundtracked it. Usually the story tells me how to soundtrack it. I don't tell the story. I don't try to create the tone. So that's actually very important, right? It's very important that you capture the tone that you want when you're laying out that particular story. And then after all of that, then you get to decide, what's the philosophy? right? So when a story comes first, that's usually how I approach things, right? Which is I make sure I have all of these things in place. And once you have all that, it turns out that there are many, many decisions you could make, all pretty good episode on its own. So for instance, I just gave you the story, right? But I haven't given you the angle of the story. You guys know this word, the angle, right? So like no matter what story you come across, especially in nonfiction, especially in journalism, like somebody can say tomorrow, I just saw this story, I get fed this story, right? There was a Tesla going 100 miles an hour in Huntington Beach that smashed into 7 different cars and then turned over and the person died. I just gave you a series of events and so on. What's the angle? What do I mean by that, right? You can think about this as having many different angles. Was the automated driver on? Right? That's a different angle than how wide are the streets in Huntington Beach, right? One is like a public safety, like in this case, it's like who's to blame, right? Now think about this story with Justin. There are so many different angles you could have, right? What are we going to explore as the content of what I want my listeners to think about when it comes to this story? Some shows are just story-based and that's it. They don't talk about the angles. But there are plenty of shows that do talk about angles, right? You can have the angle of the economics of the grief industry, right? That's a Freakonomics episode, right? And then you could and that angle drives how you structure the rest of the episode. So actually, let's do a little bit of an exercise. Like think, what are the different kinds of philosophical questions you think I could have after I just gave you this little story? Right? Just like brainstorm with me. Imagine we're at a production meeting, which production meeting really just means me talking to my wife. Hey, what about this idea? Hey, what about this idea? But, like in a real producer, like if you were on Radiolab, this is what like 3 people sitting in a room or in a Zoom room would say. All right, what's our angle? Right? What do you think? What do you think is a philosophical question that would interest you if you were like, all right, I just have this story, but I want to, turn it into a 45-minute episode with some philosophical content for the listener to think about? Anybody want to volunteer? Yeah.
I mean, he made a pretty bold statement where he was like, there will be a threshold where after a certain point you won't be able to distinguish whether that is like the real mother or like the AI avatar.
Yeah.
And that could be a whole angle where you just talk about what is that threshold.
Good.
About.
Good. You are talking about the Turing test, which is the famous test that Alan Turing gave about when you will be you cannot distinguish between a machine talking to you and another, right? That's 100% a possible angle. Let's talk about the threshold at which an individual human cannot tell the difference between them talking to their real mother and them talking to their AI avatar, and the significance of that. What is the significance of that? So, Turing said, like some people say, it's like, it's significant for, some people say it's significant for consciousness, or it's significant for personhood, or or something like that, okay? Right? Any other possibilities? Yeah.
Like where the human soul ends and like whether, the actual thing that you create in the AI is the person versus like, not. Like from a more metaphysical.
Yes, I think that's the one that most naturally I gravitated towards, right? Because when he says, I don't think the thing that you create when it's indistinguishable is actually not you, and I was like, okay, what is it? Okay, like, right? Yeah, no, that's right, because there's one way of thinking about you as just a bunch of content coming out, and then another way of thinking, right, about you is like it requires the human body, and then you're like, okay, we've got this metaphysical question about personhood, right? That's definitely another one, yeah.
I feel like that relates a lot to like the ship of Theseus.
Yes.
You have every component that makes up a person,
Yeah.
and you put it into this machine, and it's basically identical. Is it not
Yeah.
the same person?
Yeah, so good. So these are like 2 different angles. Let me just give you one more that's a very easy one that is so easy that I tend to shy away from it. But like, no matter what story, you could always ask good or bad, right? It's like right or wrong, right? And that's like definitely an angle you can give, because like it's really distinctive of philosophy to like ask questions like that, right? Like, yeah, like consent.
I mean, because the first response I had related to this was, what the hell?
Yeah. No, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Or beyond that, not just because you can, should you?
Yeah, that's right. Right. But should you is that same moral normative question.
So the reason that someone in the chat asked, will it cause more psychological issues if you can't allow yourself to grieve?
Okay. That's the one I chose. Okay? So all of these went through my mind. I was like listing them, right? And I was like, and then for this idea, I'd probably talk to this person and then we'll talk about these issues. And then with this, right? And then I thought, okay, now you have to like decide because all of these are great. And you have one episode. And right, and I'm not going to do another episode about somebody else who's trying to like revive their dead mother, right? Does that make sense? So like, and so like, and that's not even a it's not just a personal thing. It's like you know, I tend to like surprising angles, right? And like that wasn't the first thing that came to me, right? But and I also tend to like angles where like I get to learn something new. Right? And so I turned it into an episode about theories of grief. What is grief? Why do we feel it? Right? And so I was like, oh, that. And then will we continue? Is this a form of grieving or is it a form of escaping grieving? Like that's what it turned. Does that make sense? Okay, but that's just one angle. And that's the one that I ended up choosing. Right? And so naturally what I did was I went to like neuroscientists first before like the philosophers and asked them like, okay, like psychologists, neuroscientists. And so what you're going to hear is the moment it stops being the story and it starts being about the philosophical issue. And I call that moment the zoom out, right? The zoom out, it's not just me, in almost all forms of journalism that has an academic outlook or angle, you're going to have a zoom out. Doesn't matter what. And you should be familiar with it. Because if you've ever been in the grips of hearing a story, watching a documentary, let's say it's about, forget about that. If you ever watch a recipe, like YouTube cooking thing, like you're like, oh, this is how you make like Shanghai chow mein or something like that. Like there's this moment where they go, Shanghai chow mein originated in 1864. That's the zoom out, right? You see that? That's the like we're no longer in, we're now watching from above. And then now you can see a timeline, right? And for us, and for me, it's not necessarily a historical zoom out, right? It's going to be like a philosophical zoom out. So this is the moment that every single episode has moments like.
It's meant to be forever. You never have to say goodbye to them.
The motivation to find our loved ones, to connect with our loved ones, is incredibly intense.
Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor is a neurobiologist and expert on grief, and she's in a good position to explain why someone would want to do what Justin is doing.
It is motivated by some of the most powerful neurochemicals our body can produce. Dopamine, oxytocin, opioids.
The going theory in Dr. O'Connor's lab is that grief emerges from two things happening in the brain. The first is what happens to our brain when one loves or bonds with another. It's called attachment theory. When you love, your brain forms an everlasting belief that your beloved will always be in the world somewhere. When they are missing, they will either return to you or be found by you.
Okay, so that's attachment theory, right? That's forms like the start of it. Now we have a theory, right? Now we're like, oh, now we're doing like the whole thing that academics do. Is the theory true? If the theory is true, is it explain it? But if it explains it, is it a way of denying grief? Okay, now the structure of the episode is now there for you, right? And so, when I get the story first, I basically do what we just did. And once I talk to one scholar about it and learn a little something, then I get to structure the rest of the piece in response to that. And you have a 45-minute, 50-minute, Hi-Phi Nation episode about something. Okay, good. That was the story first approach, right? The story first approach, I have to make sure I have all the things that make for a good story that I showed you, right? And then you brainstorm about the angle. More typical in Hi-Phi Nation episodes, I have the philosophy first approach. And that's when somebody has a new book, like Alex Madva, in case you guys don't know, Alex has a new book, or someone has a new view, or I'm curious and I come across it. And I read a bit of philosophy. It doesn't sound like this. You don't interview Justin and talk about his mom. It's just like someone has an idea, right? And you're like, if I decide after doing a lot of that, that that's an interesting idea, I think I find a good story for, then my next job is try to reverse engineer from this idea to what I think the perfect story would be, and then to try to find if that perfect story exists. I think this is a very fun way of doing things. It's actually more typical. Let me give you an example. I actually never did this story, but I think it's a great example to talk about because it illustrates it. So here's the beginning of an article written by Roy Sorensen. It's about a very technical issue in the philosophy of language. And the technical issue is, what is the meaning of vague language? Right? Vague language is language that doesn't admit of sharp categories, like I am 5'8". 5'8" is an exact category, right? Like you are either exactly 5'8" or a little over. But I am short is not, right? Short is a, like, ooh, you know, like you can be 5'8" short. Does that make sense? You're like, that's a vague term. Okay, so there's this beginning, and I'll just read it for you. Like this is the beginning of an article by Roy Sorensen. Islamic building codes require mosques to face Mecca. The further Islam spreads, the more apt are believers to fall into a quandary. X faces Y. This is such a philosophy thing to do, like use some variable where you don't need. X faces Y only when the front of X is closer to Y than any other side of X. So the front of the mosque should be oriented along a shortest path to Mecca. Which way is that? Does the path to Mecca tunnel through the earth, or does the path follow the surface of the earth? Well, like, yeah, like yes, Mecca spreads around the world. You have to face it, but do you face east, west, north, south, right? Maybe the shortest path is over the North Pole in a certain case, right? Contemporary Western legal theorists are apt to dismiss this enigma on the grounds that there is no right answer. Even within the Islamic legal system, the vagueness of face infects the law that all mosques must face toward Mecca. A judge should just use his discretion to settle the case. However, the Islamic system has no room for this kind of discretion. Islamic law is a divine command theory. An act is illegal exactly when God forbids it. Since God is never undecided, every legal question has a determinate answer. The judge's aim is to discover what God's judgment is. Now, Sorensen actually thinks that's true. He spends the rest of the paper defending the view that there is a fact of the matter for everybody, everywhere in the universe. How do you face Mecca from that point? Does that make sense? Anyways, he's known for this view, and it's a radical view. And for a time, I thought, this is a very interesting thing that I might want people to think about, right? But this is an abstractly characterized problem. How do I find the perfect story that happened, right? I found Sheikh Shakur of Malaysia, Dr. Shakur, who was the first Muslim astronaut from Malaysia, who was sent up on the Russian space shuttle during Ramadan, right? And between sunup and sundown, he wanted to face and pray to Mecca 5 times, but he didn't know how. From sunup to sundown, you're rotating on the Earth. There are, within an hour, 16 revolutions that you see the sun, right? Does sunup and sundown mean sunup and sundown relative to your location? Does that make sense? Do you see the problem that Dr. Shakur, right? So the Muslim community set up a council of 200 scholars that met to try to resolve this problem. I think you're interested in what they've discovered, right, by now? Okay, do you see how I just reverse engineered the perfect story? Now, like so my episode would not begin with the problem. My episode would begin, right? The reason why I couldn't was because he wouldn't answer my emails to get interviewed with him. But if he did, it turns out he's a big celebrity in Malaysia already. So it's like he doesn't need some fucking philosophy professor in like New York at the time to like spend like 8 hours to spend 2 hours, talking to him. Okay, so what did you actually end up doing? Huh? Yeah. So I was gonna do this, and I ended up killing it just because I couldn't get him. But I got like 2 or 3 people that were at the council, so that they were like debating exactly what to do. By the way, it's not very satisfying. They just say, just face the earth and do it 5 times in the 24-hour period, right? But it was like interesting, like, yeah, right? But it was like interesting. You're supposed to, they said something like you index it to where you departed from, right? So like if you departed from, does that make sense? So like that's the day, so it's not like the place in space where that's the day, anyways. The other part of the zoom out that I discovered in the whole process was that, by the way, a lot of mathematical progress was made that we have today because Muslim mathematicians were trying to solve this problem of how to face Mecca over the course of the medieval period, right? So it just turns out, right, that like you have to do topography, right, in order to like solve this problem. It turns out like they came up with all kinds of really cool, that's cool, right? Right, there's your episode, right? See this? Reverse engineer. Just like found something, like in a journal that I was reading. I was like, yeah, this is interesting. Is it gonna be in the law? Right, because by the way, it turns out in the law there were other questions just like this, right? Like there's this case. I teach this in class. I don't have a podcast about it. About like you get 5 extra years if you use a gun in a crime. And then there's this case where a person used the gun to prop open the door to go in and like steal things, right? And it's like, do they get extra 5 years? Well, they used the gun, didn't they? Like, used is like this vague term, right? Right? Okay. Anyways, okay, good. So story first, right? Brainstorm angles. Angle first, reverse engineer story. Okay. Why do I do this way? Why, when I am going to make a podcast for the public, am I going to go through all of these much harder, like this harder job of doing all this to put it all together than I would just like writing a philosophy paper, right? So the reason is, okay, there was this, so do you guys all know who Michael Lewis is? So Michael Lewis is a famous author. Not like in the sense that we're authors, like a real author, the kind who sells books to Hollywood, right? So he wrote The Big Short, The Blind Side, Moneyball, what else? Everything else, right? The recent one, Going Infinite, about the, right? So he wrote a book about academics. His book was about the psychologists Kahneman and Tversky, who are famous for creating, anyways, whatever the case was, they're famous psychologists who had a theory about the way our mind works, and he had never, ever read academic work before. And for this book, he did a lot of the same things he does. Interview people, find out about their lives, tell a story about their lives. Kind of like the story of the Beatles. It reads that way. There's at least 2 guys who just get together when they're young and then like kind of change the world of cognitive psychology together, but they grow to kind of hate each other, but they love each other. It's just, there's a breakup. Most of the book is like that, but then you got to explain their work. You got to have a zoom out. And so we had to read all these papers for the zoom out. And then there's a footnote in that book, right, where he says, I just couldn't understand why academics write the way they do, he said. I just found it so hard to read it, right? And it's just this thing that if you're a student, you like learn. It's like, just, you're given like an academic paper and you're just kind of like, it feels like homework, right? I was hoping that my podcast I didn't want it to make it feel like homework. So there's this footnote in that book, and Michael Lewis describes why he thinks that academics write the way they do. And this is the quotation. The readers of academic papers in the mind's eye of the authors, right? That's important. What we're thinking when we're writing them are at best skeptical and more commonly hostile. The writers of these papers aren't trying to engage their readers, much less give them pleasure. They're trying to survive them. Okay? As soon as I saw this footnote, I was like, I got to show this to every academic who I could ever possibly show it to. Because as soon as they see it, I have not met one academic who has shaken their head, no, that's not what we do. That's exactly what we do, right?
Squirming as soon as
Yeah. That's exactly what we do. The very first thing we think when we write a single sentence is anybody going to have a problem with this? That's the very first thing we think, right? And we think of like 3 different problems they could have. They're going to think it's false. They're going to think I don't have evidence for it. Or they're going to think, you didn't think that. You got to cite somebody who did think that. These are the 3 things we think, right? We think that the person engaging with our work is going to find a problem with it. And so everything we do in that paper is to try to say, you might have a problem, but by the end, I'm still here, aren't I? You didn't find me that I said something false, that wasn't backed up, and that it was really me, and if I did my homework, I cited the right sources, okay? Now, simultaneously, what I love about this quotation is that it also highlights why, if you're not like this, if you're not a person who decides to pick up something and decide to have a problem with it, why it's so alienating to pick something up and start reading it when the person wrote it completely just thought that you were going to have a problem with it from the get-go. It's incredibly alienating to like read something and like that's what, because they're not trying to like please you, right? It's the opposite. Okay? All right. So this is great, which also means when I had to jump into this new genre, I was like, I can't do that. I can't do what I've been doing anymore. I got to train myself to do this other thing. And that's why I'm not presenting to you Justin for you to have a problem with. Maybe you do, right? But that's not what my goal is, isn't it? Right? It's more like God. It's more like, listen, guess what? I just met this guy, right? And then I start telling you. Does that make sense? Right? That's not me trying to survive you. That's like me trying to tell you, like, why do we do that with each other? I don't know. There's just this human tendency to try to be caught up with, guess what? I met this guy. And then he's trying to do this, right? And then we like open up the philosophy there. And then now I am no longer, and you are no longer in this mode that your goal is to find a problem with something I said, okay? This is the genre of academic crossover, which if you're going to try to do humanities podcasting, you should really consider, right, that when you are in academia, you are trying to survive your readership. When you're in media, you're not trying to do that. What are you trying to do in media? I think we all know the answer to that. You're trying to hold somebody's attention. That's what it is. That's what all media is, right? It's the attention economy, right? That's what we're like bemoaning, right? That's why we're saying, oh, the kids, they're just like getting held, their attention's being held by 30-second clips of stuff, not like long form. Like we're like bemoaning this kind of stuff, right? Yeah, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to hold attention. You don't hold attention by being hostile. You hold attention by doing other things. So your audience is different. In academia, you're really writing for other peers, other academics, or people studying to be academics, right? There's a sense in which the audience is beholden to you. There's not a lot of people who are reading like academic papers, but when you do, it's because it's assigned. Right? And it's assigned even in the sense that you have to do a research project. Oh, you got to read this paper. Like this is the first thing we say to students. Do a research, oh, there's this. So you got to, right? And that's the whole deal about people saying, oh, you didn't cite this. That's them saying you have to read this. If you don't read it, then there's a problem. You don't have to do anything. Like on Instagram, like you don't feel like, or like YouTube, or like when you watch it, you don't have to watch any of that stuff, right? They have to draw you to do it. To watch it. Does that make sense? And as it's going along, you can just like, I'm done, right? Right? There's not going to be a pop quiz on it, right? So it's a consumer, right, in popular journalism, right? So what you do is you're engineering to hold their attention as opposed to aiming to justify your claims, right? That's the big distinction between academia and media. Holding attention is, right, even the people who are walking around in the media justifying claims, that's not really what they're doing, right? They're trying to hold your attention, right? That's why so many shitty justifications get so much attention. You're like, oh, this person's an idiot. Right? Does that make sense? They got your attention, didn't they? That's what they're doing if they're trying to monetize. Okay. The epistemic position. The position of the person who's consuming your work in media. So the epistemic position of you as a journalist that's creating it is your audience, right? So when I talk to Justin and I talk to the grief expert, I'm not the philosopher who's their peer who's going to find a problem with what it is they're talking about. I have to be the audience, right? I have to be, what am I learning from this? What's going to hold their attention about this issue? When you're doing it for the other academics, you have to take on the role of the expert in your thing that you create, precisely because your audience is other experts, and you will not pass the test unless you demonstrated your expertise. That's the whole citation, justification part. I'm not going to say anything about what's good and what's bad. We all know there's good stuff and bad stuff about both of this, all right? It's just the difference. And if you're going to be making if you're going to be making media, podcast is just audio, right? If you're going to be making media, you got to be sensitive to this. You can't just be doing that, right? So this is what I tell all these humanists when I give workshops on this stuff. Right? A lot of them just want to get together with their friends and talk about something. So if you're like a literature scholar, you're just going to talk about, like, and I was like, well, there's this way of doing it and that way of doing it, right? And that's very important. When you are doing crossover, you are trying to do something very hard. You're trying to have a public-facing audience who is a consumer to hold their attention, but where the standards of evidence that you would use in academia are not lost, right? Otherwise, you really are just trying to be a YouTuber. Does that make sense? Right? And here's the other hard part, right? Especially if you like have some subject level expertise, you're sometimes the expert, but that you have to play the dummy, right, of the audience, right? Like, how do you do that? Like so this is something all people who do crossover work, like including people way better than me, Henry Louis Gates, Jill Lepore, like these are like famous, you know, if you're old, if you're young, you might not have heard of them, but all we're like, oh, of course, right? Like we think of like Cornel West, you know, whatever, are people who do this kind of stuff. Okay, good, wow. Given that we started 15 minutes late, I still have 4 minutes to go before I start doing some question and answer. So that's what I will say about the project itself, and like I hope it was a little bit helpful. Now let me just talk a little bit about like the actual podcasting, right? So like what I say can apply both to writing for magazines or writing popular stuff as it does to podcasting. So with podcasting in particular, the kind of podcasting that I do is a very specific kind. It's called narrative, right? It's like documentary filmmaking, right? It's kind of like there's people you talk to, but it's structured. There's a narrator, right? If you ever watch documentaries about the Civil War, the Revolutionary War, it's more like that than it is like, you know, like late night television, right? There's late night television that's funny, but there's all late night television that's serious. And that could just be two people talking, right? And that's a form. So in podcasting, which is just audio, there are lots of different formats, right? There's monologues and lectures, right? Monologues and lectures is just one person talking on the mic. There's the one-on-one interview, right? And that's always a host with a particular orientation who's prepared and a guest. And these people generally listen to because they want to learn about the Roman Empire. Roman Empire podcast, does that make sense? Or whatever. These people listen to one of two ways. They always like the interviewer, or they scroll through and find the guest they like, and then they only listen to the guest. Does that make sense? Right? Like generally speaking. Then there's this thing called panel, and panel is what I will, like this is the bunch of friends get together. People listen to this for God, what's the word? Something social? Parasocial. prepare social relationships. This is like, I have these friends, they talk once a week, I want to hang out with them, and I like get in on it. Does that make sense? Right? So this is like just like the same people, or generally the same people, occasionally with a special guest who talk to each other about a certain thing. And then you have documentary, which is sort of the genre that I do. And there's different subcategories, don't worry about that. And I talk, maybe I'll talk as though in the last minute or so, as though you're interested in that, which is, what should you do? Like if you want to do this. And my answer always is, I can't tell you, but you have to know what you're good at, right? If you are the kind of personality that people are always attracted to at parties, right? You might be the really good person to do panel because you are the kind of person somebody wants to hear from once a week. They want to know what you think. They want to hang out with you, right? If you are the kind of person who consumes information incredibly well and like asks really good questions about it, right? But you don't want yourself to be the person who's like the center, maybe you're good for a one-on-one interview. I am good at neither of those. That's why I do narrative, right? It turns out I'm really good as an editor. I can take a bunch of information and like you can actually see it. I kind of like think about it analytically, right? I like oh, the story, and then I have to break it up into plot. Does that make sense? Like that was always me, and so it turns out that's what I gravitated towards. I couldn't win people over with just my personality, right? And I don't particularly want to go after people in interviews, right? And so that turns out. So I will end there so we can have 15 minutes of Q&A because we started late. Yeah, you know. If you stick around, then we go actually philosophical issues later on. All right, thank you.
Which came first, your book or your podcast?
Oh, the podcast.
Okay. And then so
by far.
Like motivation, was it just that you got tired of discussing it in academic settings, or like you just wanted to explore a new medium and philosophy, I guess?
In podcasting?
Yeah.
Yeah, both. Okay. So the backstory is, I was really tired of doing the other thing, the thing that I showed you about. I'd gotten tenure, it was the first leave after tenure, and I was just, like the medium itself, I was actually not that early to podcasting. Like there was already a lot of people who were like doing it, but I became enamored with that form because people were starting to do it with cognitive psychology, and people were doing it with economics. And I know philosophy, so I was like, I feel like I can do that. And the reaction I got from my peers was like that's nice, right? Because it actually sounds stupid, like it's like 8 years later now, right? But think about like 8 years ago, 10 years ago, somebody says, I got an idea. Narrative storytelling journalism combined with philosophy. It's just like weird, right? It's just not, of all the humanities field, you would have thought that's the least conducive to doing that. But, you know, so that was the motivation. And then agents had already contacted me even before the first episode was released. I just didn't have a book idea until way later. And then this, like, the process was exactly like Hi-Phi Nation. So there's a way in which people who listen to the show and read this are like, will find it very familiar. Like it starts with a cop in a car going along a road in Dutchess County, New York. Does that make sense? It's not like, you know, the way a philosopher would write the thing. Yeah.
What do you think of the intersection of short form content and philosophy? So like I stumbled on this debate on TikTok between two really young debaters. One's called Dean, and another one's called Kojo.
Yeah.
They're both like non in their spaces, but
Yeah.
they're both relatively young, like
Yeah.
just coming out of high school. But they possess like pretty impressive depth of their knowledge
Yeah.
for their age, and they have an audience.
Yeah.
In the comments of the live stream, the audience are arguing amongst themselves.
Yeah.
So it's like an interesting.
I'm all for it. I don't know it because I haven't consumed much of it. Anything, it's a different art, right? It's a very different art to be able to do something substantive in a few minutes than it is an art to do something substantive in 45 minutes, which is different from doing the kind of thing in a 10,000 word paper or book. Does that make sense? All of it is a kind of art form. And if someone can successfully get people engaging in short form, I'm all for it, right? But just like with everything, there's pluses and minuses, right? Like when I showed you the media versus the academia, right? You could almost see the pluses and minuses, right? You can almost see, oh, like, so yeah, like academic writing sucks to read. It's a real burden. But we kind of want an institution like that. Like in like a society, if every institution was a media society, you'd be like, oh shit, that's a very bad society to be in. We kind of want a place where everybody's like, you don't get to say just whatever. Like I get to attack and all of your peers do, and the person who survives that gets through. Does that make sense? Like it's good that there is an institution like that. It's not good that there's only that institution, right? And so forth. And so I think short form will have plus or minuses, right? There's got to be minuses, just like there's got to be minuses to like longer form, but not too long form, and so forth. Yeah. But the young people, like all of you who consume a lot more short form, will be the critics. I would be listening to you. Like I would love to see your paper about, like, here are the downsides of doing philosophy that way. Does that make sense? Because you are much more critical consumers of that stuff than I am.
Oh, you can go. I already asked a question.
So I'm guessing science has done this for a lot longer?
Yeah, because there's an incentive in there. There's automatic funding. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking of things like something from many years ago, like Cosmos.
Yeah.
Or
Radio Lab. Oh my God. Oh geez, there's so much of that. Science Fridays. Like just all the stuff from PBS from the 70s on to now. Nova. Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So did it provide a model for you?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The thing about the science stuff is they know they have a problem because they need people to keep funding it, and it's such a depressing thing talking about that this year, right? And they know that people don't understand it, right? And they know that 99% of what they do is not going to give you material benefits, right? Right? It's like there's a lot of great examples of material benefit, like the people who studied whatever it was, Gila monster saliva, and now we have GLP-1s, right? But like that's one case, right? And that's what they say. They say you need the 99% of the stuff that goes nowhere so we can get the 1% of the things, right? It's easier to convince people that you need that with science. It's harder to convince that you need that with philosophy, actually. Mostly because people don't know what it is. And if they do think of it, in the US, in Britain they know what it is, in Australia and France they do. It's fully respected in the same way economics is or something. But here it's economics, right? Why? Because we fucking love making money. Like that's really, if it's about money making, you're gonna get people to like nod their head. But you say philosophy, they think it's like, they think it's like ancient Greek. They think it's like some lofty historical thing. So, yeah.
Do you think, he was asking, like, do you think this helps get like younger generations into like philosophy or like some of these harder subjects that people think are too hard to understand or too academic, or like, I think like you were saying with the Nova documentaries and stuff like that, like I remember watching those and being a lot into science because like I was like, this is so cool, like this is cool, and then having a more media facing like podcast could definitely like influence like younger generations to be more interested in this.
That's the hope. That's the hope with younger generations and even older generations. Like no generation knows about this. But like, it's like it's in this country. It's not like a thing that it's on anybody's radar. That's why it's so hard to like explain to if you're first gen like I was, it's so hard to explain to your abuelita like, this is what I'm saying. It's like, that's nice, like, you know what I'm saying, right? It's so, but they can understand a discussion of this guy created a computerized version of his mom and is now talking to it after his mom died, like, right? That's the hope. That's the hope. It's, I actually found funding for and run a program. It's in this last year now, it's 4 years now, to try to get other philosophers to do this kind of thing, right? And so I got 45 every year for the last 4 years. right? But whether they go on to do it is a completely different thing about going through the program. That's the hope. The hope is to bring this, younger people. Like, I would love, 8 years ago, I would have said yes. Now I don't know if younger people even listen to podcasts, right? 8 years ago they did. The last millennials, they love podcasts, right? But now it's like, right? Now if you listen to a podcast, you're probably 30 and older, right? So does that make sense? So I would love, but that just means that the next stage is to get the media where the young people are looking. And it might exactly be this kind of thing, right? The short form stuff.
I was wondering about, like everyone, well, maybe not, maybe this is over, but everyone had a podcast, right?
Probably still true, actually.
Like, I love your podcast, and a couple of the episodes I like the most are the philosophy of music one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, just getting
I love those too.
I love them so much, and there's like lines in some of the episodes that it just strikes me probably comes out of your process that couldn't have happened if you were doing a philosophy paper. You get this specific insight. And so I'm wondering specifically for you, like, it strikes me that the podcast is so good because of you as the person doing the podcast. So I'm wondering, do you get more philosophically out of the podcast? Are you getting something different philosophically? Is it,
100%. I get.
How much is your philosophical rewards tied into them?
It comes almost 100% from that. Sort of the reason I started doing it was I felt something was missing from what we're supposed to do, right? Which is like read the journal, come up with a response, come up with something to say, that kind of stuff. So I get a lot out of, I got this book deal and then the one I literally have another book due December 31st. It was due the 1st, but I asked for an extension. It was due like 3 days ago. But I have the words, it's just, anyways. And that came basically from the first episode, of the show. And I got a book deal from the first episode of it. So I get a lot. But you have this other question: how much of the podcast is like me? And the answer is every podcast should be the reflection of your particular vision. If you have an editorial vision, if you're not otherwise you're kind of like a worker in somebody else's project, which is okay. Not everybody has to be the person who creates that vision. Does that make sense? And so the music ones are a great example, right? Because I actually I find those the most fun, and I might do I could do a whole podcast just for that, because I actually like music production, right? And you could hear it. I put in the way that I cut things together. I actually put in I did a whole episode about mashups, which is super millennial. But what's the philosophy of mashups? Well, listen to the episode, right? It's a fun episode. I did a whole episode about cover songs, right? I did an episode about musical illusions. So how you might hear things, distances, and and then I did a whole episode about AI generated music, and I had guitarists solo, improv solo, battle against the AI improv solo, which was really fun. That was 2023. That all comes from me. That's all me just sitting around going, oh, it'd be cool to put together. Yeah.
I enjoyed that episode. I shared that actually with the students who are actually working on, or doing something on music piracy.
Yeah.
So I was actually curious about because one of the things I love about the podcast format versus the paper format is the digital storytelling element.
Mm-hmm.
Figuring out how to actually tell a story, because it's a really different structure.
Yeah.
I loved your comparison, that juxtaposition of the consumer base versus the academic approach. How did you train yourself into that? Did you read certain things? Did you just listen to a lot of podcasts? How did you train yourself into kind of digital storytelling?
What I missed was this is the part of this presentation that I give to the National Humanities Center for graduate students and faculty who want to make their own, right? Which is, what is distinctive about this medium that's not true of writing, right? And by the way, video is very different too. There's all kinds of genres. There are there is a format to a TED Talk, right? There is a format to, right now, all of the YouTubers, there's a format now. It's like evolved into like, you know exactly how they're going to cut between camera A and camera B, right? There's, you know, I know when the zoom out's coming when I watch like cooking videos or like some, like there's a format to them. And so there are a bunch of things about audio that I will just leave as this slide, very distinctive. The importance of opening. So in audio, if you have them at 2 minutes, you have them at 5. If you have them at 5, you have them for 50. Is like this thing that is like a proven empirical point where if you hold their attention for the first 5 minutes with something, they will listen to the whole episode, right? But if they turn off by then, like it's gone. You're not going to get them back. In audio, you produce to times, right? In papers, you produce to lengths, like word counts. In paper writing, you have the benefit of punctuation, spacing, chapter breaks, paragraph breaks. You don't have that in audio. So then you have to use music, gaps, spacing. There's all kinds of stuff from here. Audio is a visual medium. That's a crazy thing to think about. But anytime audio gets more visual, like, all right, let's walk over to the wall. Oh my God, there's a divot there. I can feel it. Like if you hear that, people stay listening as opposed to, you know, like not having somebody being able to picture things, right? So there's a way in which audio is a very visual medium. Start from the best tape writing structure around that. If you collect enough material, right, you organize an episode, a piece, around the best sounding things people say. Right? That's very different than in paper, right? In print journalism, basically what you do is you get people to quote just to confirm what it is you want to write. But in audio, it's the opposite. You have to find the best sounding stuff, and then you structure everything else around it. Right? So there's a couple of things that I'll say about that.